Jan was white against Ding. This is game 9. The score of the match before this game was 4.5, 3.5 for Jan. They played another Rui Lopez. In the previous games, Ding had played a6. And here Ding played knight f6, the Berlin. And white played the only move that I think is acceptable here, d3. The anti-Berlin. And actually, I had this position against Fabi in the Pro Chess League. And I had to go to therapy for like 2 years after the beating he gave me. And I'm okay now. I have nightmares still, but... And I played d6 because that's what I play. But good players play bishop c5. What's funny about this is, after castles, good players play knight takes e4, and I play bishop c5. Okay, so this has been played in hundreds of Grandmaster games. Thanks, Nils, 1987. Okay, so c3 was played, and Karen texted me. Oh, okay. No. Okay, c3. And one of the points of c3 is if white doesn't play c3, thanks Virtual Sandon, if white plays something like castles, black will play knight d4 and trade pieces. And that's also a main line. There's nothing wrong with that. But c3 stops all that. You know, white's trying to stop trades. He's trying to make the game interesting. Okay, castles, castles. And now black played d5, which is one of the main lines. Knight b d2. And you could get similar position from the Italian game with the bishop like being here. It's a very similar kind of position. Okay, and then after knight b d2, he traded on e4. And these kinds of positions I've always favored for white because this knight's not well placed. It can't go to d4. And this knight is going to do some rigmarole like this or this. Sometimes we'll play b4, bishop b6, knight c4, and we'll get the two bishops. And it's hard to figure out what to do with black's pieces unless you're 2800 and have lots of prep. Then it's pretty easy to figure it out. Okay, so he played a5. That was recommended by Fabi. I woke up at 5 a.m. and I watched the live commentary with Tanya, Hess, and Fabi. And a5 obviously prevents b4. It gains some space on the queen side. And it allows white to try to win a pawn by taking here and taking here. If you don't take on e5, you're just giving black two bishops and the white squares. And the pawn weaknesses don't matter very much. I mean, black's going to play bishop a6, and I mean, those bishops are pretty good. So we can try to win a pawn. Knight takes e5. And black has more than one move here. Black can play queen d6, or black can play rook e8. During the game, I was wondering about queen e8, but the engine doesn't give that as a move. And then, obviously, if black gets his pawn back, he should be just fine. And the engine says this is about equal. And I'm sure the players know this line. Because white's always trying to win a pawn on the Rui Lopez, and sometimes black shouldn't allow it, and sometimes black should allow it. And here the engine just says it's equal. And it's actually giving a line where knight b3, you can't take the knight because queen takes queen. If you trade queens and take the knight, I play knight takes, and you can't take back because you get checkmated. Okay, so after knight b3, this is the engine line. Now this pawn's hanging, so the engine plays here. Queen takes, it takes this. And even though black is down a pawn here, the engine says it's equal. a4, queen d6. We have opposite colored bishops. and black's bishop is going to go to b7 and be really good. This bishop, so this knight has the good d5 and e4 squares. The bishop has b7. These two pawns hold back these three pawns. And even though black is down a pawn, the engine says white has no advantage. And I'm sure the players know these variations and so forth. Okay, so white played a4, positional move, defending the bishop, gaining some space. Black played queen e7. So all those variations I just showed you are irrelevant because the pawn's defended now. So there's no bishop takes and knight takes anymore. Queen c2, defending the pawn. This lets the white knight do some kind of rigmarole, which they do a lot in the Ruy Lopez. As I said earlier, something. Knight's going to do something. Okay, and now black played a move that I really like. I like retreating moves when they're good. And I was complaining earlier that the knight on c6 wasn't well placed. It can't go anywhere. So he played knight b8, setting up for the next game. And this is reminiscent of the Breyer variation of the Ruy Lopez, where you play knight here, knight here. He's going to play c6, and we're going to have a very symmetrical pawn structure where it's hard to say that anybody has an advantage. White probably has a tiny advantage because white's going to be like a tempo ahead because white didn't play knight here, knight here. Yay, such strong support. No, it's not an early shift. I always stream at this time to do a recap of the game. You should watch the stream more. Okay, so he played rook e1, which defends the pawn more, but more importantly, it vacates the f1 square, so we can play bishop f1 later, and more importantly, knight f1, knight g3, or knight e3. And if you want to play the knight to e3, I'm not saying you do, but if you do, and you play knight c4 to e3, because why are you wasting a tempo? Knight c4 traps the bishop, then c6, and the bishop's trapped. Fabi thought probably white would play h3 just to stop knight g4 and bishop g4, and then play rook e1. But he wasn't worried about knight g4. Black played rook d8. It was clear that Ding Liren was in his prep. He was playing very quickly. Okay, h3, h6. It's hard for white to do anything to break the symmetry. So he played knight f1 finally to go to g3, c6. Bishop went back to c4. And now Ding surprised the commentators on the chess.com channel. I don't know about the FIDE ones, if they were surprised. We thought knight bd7 would happen at some point, and then black could play the same way as white with approximate equality. And the engine does like knight bd7, but he played knight a6, and he played it very quickly, so we think he was still in prep. And we think at this point, Jan was out of prep because this move looks a little unusual. Now, there's two ideas behind knight a6. And there's another point to make is the bishop's not blocked, which may or may not matter, but probably better, all things being equal, not to block a bishop when you don't have to, because a blockaded bishop is of little value. If you watch The Simpsons, you would know that. So black has two ideas. One is to play knight c7, knight e6. The other is to move the bishop and play knight c5. Okay, white played knight g3, completing his rigmarole. And I have to tell you a funny story. In the National Open many years ago, I'm going to say 2005, but I could be like 10 years off. I played Nick DeFermian in the last round on board 1, and we both had 4.5 out of 5. And I had black, and we agreed to a draw before the game, which is illegal but common. And it's frowned upon in round robins. In Swisses, when you don't get any conditions and there's only like 3 prizes and there's 20 GMs, you got to do what you got to do. You can't have 4.5 out of 5 and be on board 1 and lose the last round and win no money. You can't be a professional player and win no money. So by drawing, we guaranteed we tied for first. And he played knight here and knight here into Ruy Lopez. It was like move 12. And I offered him a draw. And he said something I didn't understand. And he moved his knight. So I made a move and he was confused. And the reason he declined my draw was he wanted to get his knight over to g3. He didn't want to be on the way to g3 and then agree to a draw. He thought that looked better. Cocaine is a hell of a drug. Anyway, so when I moved, he thought I declined his draw. He actually made like this move and offered a draw. I didn't understand what he said because I offered him a draw and he made a move. And he offered a draw with his move. Then I made a move and he was like, you don't want to draw? And I said, yeah. He said, okay, draw. Thanks, Exops Hova. It is nonsensical. Yeah. Okay. So the knight often does this maneuver. And I believe we've already seen it in this match. Okay. Now, black played queen c7, which gives away his intention of not playing knight c7 due to its illegality. And it would lose his queen if he takes his own queen. So therefore, if his knight's on a6 and he's not going to play knight c7, he's going to always play bishop f8 and then play knight c5. At this point, you can see Ding Liren still had tons of time, and this was probably his prep, and he was being praised for having good prep, which equalizes. Okay, and I agree. And in this position, Jan confused the commentators by playing bishop a2. Then about 5 moves later, the commentator said, wow, that was a great move. After they were like, what the hell's that move? Okay, now black did something that was unnecessary, but Ding was feeling it. I have a story about, but I was feeling it, but I could never tell anybody ever. I could tell Giannis. That's about it. Okay, like if heaven exists and God says, tell me that story, I'll be like, I can't tell you. That's, I could tell Giannis. Anyway, so, like if you gave me 1,000 subs, I wouldn't tell you the story. We can try. Give me 1,000 subs and I won't tell you. Okay. So in this position, black could continue on his journey to play knight c5. So he could play bishop f8, knight c5, and the engine says it's equal. But he got like cocky, and his move isn't terrible, but it's cocky, especially for Ding. Played b5. So he's like, I have no problem, and I can do whatever I want. And maybe I'll play for a win. Okay, 1,001 maybe. Okay, so white played queen e2, excellent move, attacking the pawn. And in this position, black played too slowly. Black needs to ignore his pawn and play bishop f8 due to the very important rule, which I don't know if Ding is aware of it. I don't know. Now, you guys think I'm joking, okay? But I'm not. A lot of the super grandmasters know my rules, right? The rules that everybody makes fun of. A lot of the super grandmasters know those are my rules. So my rule, always play bishop f8. Some super grandmasters know that I say that, and some don't. Probably Ding doesn't. And you have to ignore this pawn and play bishop f8 and play knight c5 ASAP. And the reason you're playing it ASAP is you like hip hop? I don't know. Or is that $$ AP? I don't know. I'm too old to make these jokes. Anyway, and if you play knight c5 and nothing has happened, this pawn is attacked, and my knight could be trying to hop into d3, which is one of the reasons earlier in the game and by earlier I mean 2 moves ago, Fabi and Hess were like bishop a2, qu'est-ce que c'est? And they thought, now if I play knight c5, I have the d3 square for my knight, so maybe the bishop should be here. Okay, then this pawn sacrifice is interesting. Take a pawn, knight c5. Now, black is threatening bishop a6, and the queen is trapped. So Fabi thought queen e2 was the only move, and the engine says, Ish don't think so. The engine says I can play b4. That looks pretty risky. And black is just getting lots of compensation. Knight d3 attacking the rook, bishop a6 attacking the queen. This pawn's attacked 3 times. The 3rd time is this bishop, which you don't see because it's too far away. And the engine says this is all zeros. Okay, so bishop f8's the best move. Shocking. Glum Hippo gifted a sub, and if you'd like, you can put the bishop f8 emote in the chat. Always play bishop f8. Instead, Ding protected his pawn, which loses a tempo, and gives white time to attack. Played rook b8, not a good move. And white played sort of the obvious way to play when you play the knight over here. You want to play knight here and get one of your knights here. Occasionally, you get one of your knights here because the bishop is pinning, and the queen's going to go to f3. Now, one thing I want to point out that the commentators didn't is in this game, white played queen c2 and then queen e2, and black played queen e7 and then queen c7. I thought that was interesting. You might not agree, but, we think differently. Okay, so white played the obvious knight h4, which Fabi had been suggesting every move the last 10 moves. Knight h4, knight h4, knight h4. Now the queen goes to f3. My knights come in. Papa John's. And black is actually too slow to stop the play. And the engine says white is approximately +1 here. Like on the verge of winning if 2 super engines are playing. The verge. It's like half draw, half win. Just because of this one inaccuracy. Okay. So he played bishop f8 because we got to play knight c5. We can't play knight a6 and leave our knight on a6 forever. It's very important to activate your pieces. Also, the bishop needs to be on f8 so we don't get quadruple checkmated by everything. Okay, so queen f3. And now everybody thought he would play knight c5, but he took on a4, which actually transposes. White played bishop takes h6. If you take the bishop, then I take the knight, and black's king is somewhat naked, just like I was the dermatologist. So, and it ain't pretty. And black played the move knight c5 very quickly. Rook takes b2 is not good, because we need to play knight here, so we can play rook here attacking the queen in the instance of bishop g5. If white plays bishop g5, black would prefer, and by prefer, I mean really prefer, the queen's not on f3. Because that's too annoying. So black plays knight c5, and the idea is if bishop g5, which is the engine move, which he didn't play, now we play rook d3, attacking the queen, and when the queen moves, then we can move our knight here. And, black has play on the b file, on the d file. The knight's good here. This bishop is attacked. And, white's better, but white's not winning. White's better. And instead of playing bishop g5, which is the engine move, played knight g6, which is the second engine move. Because it looks scary. And white wants to play knight takes f8 and get rid of the black bishop, which is a good defensive piece. And then white has the 2 bishops. He'll play bishop g5, and he'll have an obvious advantage. Now, in this position, the engine and the commentators, Hess and Fabi and Tanya, thought rook d3 would be played. But Ding instead played rook takes b2. If he's going to get mated, he might as well take a pawn. And what this does is not only wins a pawn and gives me these passed pawns, it also threatens to take on a2, the bishop that's pinning the f pawn, so then you can take the knight on g6. Therefore, knight takes f8 was played. Rook takes f8. And in this position, the engine wants to play bishop c4 and says white has a very nice advantage. But instead he played bishop g5, which gives away all of his advantage. It's too passive. Knight h7, which is the only move. Bishop c1, which is an excellent move. He's going to reroute the bishop to a3, which is very annoying. And now Ding made a mistake, which I don't blame him. Now, I also don't blame Jan for his mistake of playing bishop g5 and then bishop c1, because the correct move for black here is very engine-y. It's not a move a human would play, although Fabi suggested it. And he doesn't use the engine unless he sees what the engine says. But when he suggests a move, he doesn't look at the engine and then suggest a move. Fabi was wondering, what if I play rook c2? And if you're Ding and you're Jan and you don't have engines helping you like everybody does, rook c2 looks suspicious. And I know rook c2 is the best move, and I'm still suspicious. That's how suspicious it is. That rook looks like it's getting trapped. In fact, the rook is trapped. But the engine says rook c2 equal. There's nothing you can do. Thanks, Takhan. Thanks, King Slayer Sloan, for the raid. Please give a shout out. So, white has some obvious ways to attack the rook, but they don't work. If you play bishop b1, then I can take the bishop and play knight to b3, forking the rooks. If you play queen d1, you're unprotecting your c3 pawn. So strangely, you can't really win my rook. And at some point, I'm going to either sack the exchange here or play rook b3 and sack the exchange and get 3 connected passed pawns on the queen side. So, c'est pas facile. And in this position, without much thought, like seconds, Ding played rook b5. Probably both players thought rook c2. There's no way that could work. And the engine says, yeah, rook c2 is okay. Now, even though Fabi saw rook c2, if he was playing it in the game itself, he would think a long time. Because if you play rook c2 and lose your rook in 2 or 3 moves, people laugh at you. They're like, what are you doing putting your rook on c2? What's wrong with you? So he'd have to look a lot and make sure that it's okay. I thought rook b5 was a good move. That's the move I would play. And the reason is I'm defending my knight. If, for example, we retreat all the way, then bishop a3 wins the game. And if you defend your knight, I have queen e3. Like queen e7, queen b6, queen a7, queen e3 is winning. So he played rook b5 because now if bishop a3, the knight is defended. And if at any point white throws in the moves bishop a3 and c4, black just plays rook b4 and says, take my rook. I dare you. I double dare you. And then when Jan says what, Ding will say, do they speak English and what? Okay. So I thought this was fine. Okay, bishop a3, that's the correct move. Rook e8, that's the correct move. Bishop c4, that's the correct move. Now the rook can't move because the knight's attacked. But if white takes the rook and black takes, that really improves black's pawn structure. And potentially black has passed pawns on the queen side. That's a much improved pawn structure if I take this. So he has to sack the exchange. So he played here. And now there was funny commentary. Hess interrupted the commentary and said his producers told him the engine wants to play bishop takes e6 and then queen d1. And Fabi laughed and said, there's a 0% chance that will happen. And then that's what happened. And that's why these guys are playing for the world championship. Because Jan won 2 candidates in a row, not because he was lucky. These players are strong. And Fabi preferred the move queen e2, which my engine also prefers. My engine is not as good as the engine that's being used by the players, commentators. Bishop takes b5 is the most testing move. Then we're up in exchange for a pawn, and we have yet to see whether these pawns will become strong. And the engine says white's up like 0.8. Doesn't say very much. And he took the bishop, and after knight takes, he did not play queen d1 to play queen takes a4. He played knight f5, which my engine says is the right move. c5, because obviously knight f5, and the knight's coming to d6. Now, once I was rated by Jan Nepomniachtchi, and I think he knows my rules. I think he knows always play knight f5. Otherwise, why would he raid me? And so he knows, what to do. c5 stops knight d6. Queen e2 threatens the rook. Rook b3 and queen c4 threatening this pawn. Black's up a pawn, but black's position looks sort of strange. Knight's on h7, doubled isolated pawns, isolated pawn. All these are weak. My queen's in a perfect square. My knight's on a perfect square. And even though black is up a doubled pawn and white has all these positional advantages, the engine says equal because the engine always says equal. Okay, queen c6, defending the pawn. Bishop c1, attacking the pawn. Knight f6, because the knight sucks on h7. And here, Jan surprised the commentators by taking with the queen. If you take with the rook, which is fine, then rook takes c3, and the queen is overworked here. Queen takes, queen takes, queen takes to establish material equality. Now, the engine thinks after queen b4, black is slightly better. And if I was playing in a tournament here, I wouldn't know, because this looks really good. And my bishop coming here looks good, and your 2-pass pawns look good. And my rook is hanging. And the engine slightly prefers black here. So rook takes a4, throws all advantage away. So he played queen takes a4. And this leads to a drawn endgame. Takes, takes, takes. Bishop b2, which wins the e pawn. He'll win all of these pawns. Rook b3, he takes. Now it's equal material, but this pawn's pretty weak. So he plays rook b4. White doesn't want to take the rook and give black 2 connected pass pawns. And this is petered out to a drawn endgame. However, it's better to have white because of the move rook a4, which was played. Now, if 2 engines are playing, black plays knight to d2. If a human's playing, knight d2 is a little funky. And there was a funny variation they were looking at. If white tries to win a pawn, then as you all know, trying is the first step to failure. It looks like white wins a pawn, but instead, white loses all of his pieces. Check, and knight takes rook, or knight takes knight. Okay. So the engine plays knight d2 and says it's equal. And as a human, knight d2, and knight's sort of funny there. And we have a big attack against the king. So he decided to bail out, and he played knight d4, which goes into this pawn down endgame, which should be a draw. Okay, and The rook and pawn ending is pretty drawn. The knight and pawn ending gives some winning chances, some, and the king and pawn ending is winning. And the players know that. Even I know that. Weird. Okay. So king g7, and nothing much happened. Knight g3 was cute. If you take it, you take this, and that's a dead draw. And he played knight f5. Both players were aware that this endgame is a draw if you trade knights. Even though white's a pawn up, these pawns stop these two pawns, and this pawn is easily stopped by the king. And there's not much that white can do. It's actually a pretty easy draw. And Fabi knew that. He was like, this has no winning chances. So you keep pieces on the board. Then he went for the knight endgame, and he declined. And in this position, if it's black to move, black could play knight h6 and try to go into the rook ending. Rook b7 prevents that, because after knight h6, which is a blunder, I take, and I defend my pawn. So he played knight d6, king f8, unpinning his pawn. And f5 is a really big decision, which I'm not a fan of. I don't like the move f5. Now, it still draws, but I think it makes the draw more difficult because black's king is cut off, and the further black moves his pawns, the more likely they'll get captured. So I don't like the move f5. Now, the obvious idea is if the knight moves, knight e4 check wins this pawn. So white plays the finesse, king to f3, attacking the rook. Then when the rook moves away, which he went here, now he's forcing the knight, the end game. Your rook's hanging and your knight's hanging. So instead of taking the rook, he checked first, and then he took the rook. And you could take either way and draw. He decided to take with the king. And after knight e5, there's no way to protect your pawn, so you have to play g5. And this is on the precipice of losing, but it's not losing. And at first, g4 looks like it wins. f4 loses to h4, and black's pawns all go away, and the thermometer goes up, and white wins. And this move also loses. Actually, no, that move doesn't lose, it says. The reason it doesn't lose is you can't play king takes pawn because I check and take your f pawn. That's funny. But Fabi thought he would play king e7 and then play king f6, and this is a fairly easy draw. Okay, so Jan thought forever here, and this is where I went to the doctor. Like in this position. Jan thought like 10, 15 minutes here. And he played h4, put it in h. And black has one move that draws. The obvious moves are takes, g4 check, and knight e4. One of them draws and the other two lose. Takes, that's the only move that draws. King f4. He played h3. h3 is not necessary. King e7 also draws. But Ding was pretty confident he knew this was a drawn endgame. King e7. King f6. Knight attacks the f-pawn. We can't let him take the f-pawn. And obviously when white plays f3, he can't win. He played f3. Come on. Knight here. You can't give your pawn away. Check. Okay, and this is a 2 against 1 where black's pieces are perfect. So there's no winning chances, really. But Jan tried. Trying is the first step to failure. Now, what's funny is king takes f4 draws. It looks like white wins here, but black plays king takes f3 and draws. And then king g2, and then they both queen. I'm sorry, they don't both queen. I get my pawn on the 7th, and if this king was on one of these squares that I'm highlighting, white would win. but the king here is still a draw. It's very close. If white could get his king on one of these squares, he would win. But he's here, so he can't win. Now, there's no reason to do that. Just play knight here and draw. No reason to play a difficult draw when you can do an easy draw. There's just nothing going on here. Decided to play f4 and go take the pawn. Now he's threatening this pawn, and he's threatening this pawn, and this knight can't defend this pawn. Also, I'm threatening knight f5 and take this. So, and they agreed to a draw because the king's going to go here, the only legal move, and then I'm going to take the pawn. Or after h5, I play king g5. Or anything. So, very well played game. Jan had serious winning chances in the middle game. Ding defended really well, and the game ended in a draw. Was the longest game of the match, 82 moves. And another exciting game where all three results were possible, and Ding defended very well and didn't really get into bad time trouble. So the score of the match is now 5-4 for Jan. Tomorrow's a rest day. And then on Sunday, Ding will have white. Yeah, this is really interesting. And so forth. Mainly and so forth. Every game exciting. Yeah. And there are a lot of great moves this game, like in the previous games. Especially when Fabi said there's a 0% chance he'll play bishop takes e6, then he played it. Oh, snap. Yeah, I do better recaps when I watch the live analysis if I wake up at 5. Then I can see what everybody's saying about it in the engines. And I'm better prepared than if I just look at it. Then I'm like, duh. Yeah, I got a text from Rapport, because we have a good rapport, and he said, what do I do about the leak? And I said, depends. Okay, who do I raid? We got Hikaru, Chessbra, I Am Rosen.